Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We positively have an incredible deal going on. If you've heard the radio station, if you're listening to AM 1570, you've heard my wife talk about the wheels on the bus going round and around. And I don't mean the Jerome Bettis bus. I'm talking about the Taharka bus here. Ice cream delivered to you, $15.70 off an 8-pack. It's better than beer. They only give you 6 beers. You get 8 pints of ice cream, just $5 a pint, just over $40 if you use the Baltimore Positive code. Make sure you're doing that, and you can have delicious peanut butter cup or mint flicks and chills, or my favorite, my new favorite. I had some of this to soothe the pain of the Ravens loss on Wednesday afternoon. I've never said that before, Luke. The Ravens lost on Wednesday afternoon. I had some sweet potato crumble. You don't have any of that, but your mom does have some vanilla bean lying around, so I'm sure you'll take care of yourself here this weekend. I actually made my Thanksgiving meal, the last leftover we had. I actually had with John Harbaugh and with Bradley Bozeman in the postgame there. A week later than we thought, all of the stories will be told. I liked at one point that Collinsworth said in the broadcast, Harbaugh says he's got a chapter in his book out of this one. I'm like, well, good. Maybe one day we'll actually know what the hell went on last week, huh?
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's, I think, frustrating. That's what's so, there's just so much unknown with this. You hear Roger Goodell talk, you hear the Ravens talk after the game. It was nice to actually hear from some people after 10 days of radio silence from the organization. And I get it to a degree, but not entirely, because at the same time, it's like, what's going on here? But there is so much unknown. I'm not sure we're going to get 100% full disclosure of what the heck happened. You and I have debated the merits of playing a game when you're down so many players. I've said all along that part of it, the league laid out from a very early time with an expanded practice squad, with flexible roster rules. But the inconsistency in the mitigation, from a mitigation standpoint, where you give the Ravens the all clear to reopen the facility last Monday, when clearly it was the start of a widespread outbreak. That creates plenty of questions at the very least, and plenty of angry people under very understandable circumstances.
And by the way, RG3 made it kind of clear that the wives are pissed, the families are pissed. That they then brought COVID home to the house, because the wives are probably saying, I don't even go to the supermarket, dude. I mean, I'm trying to keep you on the field. You make $400,000 every week. We need to keep you playing. Right. You know what I mean? Like that's the reality of all of it, right? Literally.
And that is the reality for these players, these coaches, and their families. The concern has been much more it coming from the community. Now, even going back to Steve Saunders, this virus, the transmission had to come from somewhere else. The building, it's not as though the virus just manifested in the building. It came from outside, but the overall concern, because of all the efforts they'd gone through to mitigate and social distance and wear masks and have the trackers for the contact tracing, was to prevent it from spreading inside the building. And the concern was what? The families, right? The wives, the girlfriends, the kids, whomever, in terms of those individuals infecting a player. That's kind of been what we've talked about more so. But for this to play out the way it did,
well, the big concern wasn't that one player will get COVID, right? They knew that was going to happen, and that's Goodell's point, I guess. Look, I'm not going to stand up for him, but he's going to say, hey, we had one guy here and 2 guys there and 1 guy there, and Tennessee screwed around, and we read them the riot act, and they went and won a couple of football games. Good for them. We made Denver play without quarterbacks the other day. It's pretty clear to me that the Ravens' culpability as a franchise, as an organization, there was some really, really sloppy stuff that went on last week that, much like the Trump government, they're going to try to sweep it up and dust it up, wear a mask and no speaky, and Harbaugh's going to say, Chad Steele will deal with that later. Chad Steele's not going to deal with anything. Think Chad Steele's going to tell me what the hell's going on out there? I mean, at some point when they go on these hostage videos, somebody – Dick Cass, somebody, Steve needs to get out in front of this, because John doesn't want to get out in front of this, because John's got to play the Cowboys on Tuesday night. And, this almost goes back to the Ray Rice thing, that it's a little bit of, if it's John's call to handle it, then John has to handle it, but saying we'll deal with that later. No. The fan base moved 4 times for you, showed up on Wednesday afternoon. Half of your team's sick. Half of your players were out on Twitter talking about, like literally Wildcats striking the game, literally.
Yeah.
And now you hold a gun to all the players' heads and say, don't say anything. Don't say anything on the hostage video. Don't give them anything. Don't walk into the trap question. And we're just going to move on and play the Cowboys because that's what they want us to do. I think certainly the national media is going to come in on this. And as to how half the team went off the side of the cliff and how that possibly could have happened, where in order to walk on the campus, you have to have your nose swabbed.
Right. Well, and there we get into timing of testing and things of that nature. Look, I want to be clear before I go into some of the points you just made that I absolutely agree with. We are playing in the midst of a pandemic, and these are very unprecedented times. These are things that 10 months ago, no one in the organization was even thinking about. So acknowledging that this is something new that we're dealing with. We're not talking about failing to upgrade the wide receiver position. Even in the Ray Rice thing, as much as that was very poorly handled, that wasn't something that had never happened before to an NFL player or an NFL team. But that acknowledgement aside, yeah, I'd like to know why it's been radio silence from the decision makers at the top. And I do think there's, not that John Harbaugh shouldn't have to answer for it, because, if the reports leading back to Steve Saunders, I mean, that's part of John's staff. He's responsible for him at the end of the day. But at the same time, John Harbaugh hasn't been in charge of the mitigation efforts for the entire organization. He didn't design the protocols, for example. He wasn't the one who was overseeing the changes they made to their building. That's Dick Cass. Where's Dick Cass been in this? And I think that's a very legitimate question. I think there's absolutely an argument to be made and whether it was last Thursday, whether it was Monday morning, or even the morning of the game on Wednesday, why not put Dick Cass on a Zoom, let the media answer or ask some questions, let him put some, and I know you can't address everything from a HIPAA standpoint as far as describing players' symptoms and things of that nature. I understand that there could be some liability issues here that he's going to tread carefully as someone who clearly has, he works in law. So you're not going to necessarily get a 100% pull back the curtain, full transparency, but at least allow a glimpse of what the heck happened. At least present some semblance of accountability. And
by the way, it's also a wonderful cautionary tale for the community to say, we really effed up, and it cost us. You saw what it cost us. Don't have this happen in your workplace. Don't have this happen in your school. Don't have this happen to your Little League team, whatever Little League team you may be thinking about fielding. During the holidays here. Don't let this happen at your holiday when grandmom comes over and winds up dead on January 10th. There's a lot of things that the league has talked about getting out on front of, and it's a ruse, like calling Kaepernick. You know what I mean? Like, it's just talk. And when I see Goodell's beady little eyes shift left and right as they ask him these questions in the aftermath of why this football game was being sanctioned, it's being sanctioned for the money. Why don't they just step up and say, well, you do know it's for the money. Now, other than the fact that we're a business and this is American, and we care a lot about our players, but I mean, ultimately, we're really not concerned with Lamar being home any more than we are concerned with Johnny U being dead. They don't play here anymore. We're concerned with RG3 this week playing because that's the game. So let's focus on the game and RG3 and Trace McSorley, because that's the way they think. They don't think about who's not playing. They only think about, like, fill the helmet with a warm, breathing body, make it look like an NFL game. And again, I said this earlier, the best and the worst thing happened Wednesday, right? Like, half the team went off the cliff on a bus over the weekend, and they played the game anyway, and the Ravens almost won, which is what these clowns in baseball say every time the Tampa Rays go to the World Series. Well, our system's fine. It's fine that the Yankees spent $300 million and the Rays spent $40 million because they went to the World Series. So it all balances out. See, it doesn't all balance out. It's they try to create something that's fair that makes us interested. What happened on Wednesday was the JV, as brought up by several of the Steelers in the aftermath. The Ravens put the JV on the field, and they ran with the varsity. That's music to the ears of Roger Goodell that says we can get along without Colin Kaepernick. We can get along without anybody that's uppity. We can get along without anybody that's injured. We can get along without the virus. And by the way, Players Association, if you strike, we'll bring some guys in from Bemidji State. We'll dress them up in purple, put a number 8 on them, we'll run them around out there. That's always there. It felt like a scab game to me. And it was a much more competitive game, to your point, that RG3 is a real quarterback and Trace McSorley's a real quarterback, than whatever that Denver thing was, which to me, that's a stain on the game. That's something that never should have been sanctioned. We can make our arguments about the Ravens back up 20, running with the Steelers for 3 quarters or whatever you want to say, but it's also something that shouldn't be sanctioned. By the way, I was embarrassed by what the Marlins did. Well, I was even more embarrassed that they beat the Orioles here. But when leagues are doing that at this point, that's when it goes Eddie Feigner for me. And this season's become very Eddie Feigner this week. And maybe it'll level out. We'll have no more COVIDs, and we'll be. I don't believe that, by the way. I'm not a scientist, but I've been paying attention to 2,700 deaths in America on the same day we're playing football games, and the same day that the con artists running the country is making 46-minute hate videos, trying to stir up the pop. I mean, all that's going on for real, and they're trying to play a football game like this. So I don't know that I'm concerned that the season's Eddie Feigner. I thought back in August it could go that way, and then it's about what they're going to allow. Where's the bumper rails on playing without quarterbacks and playing without half the team? There's no bumper rail on this. That's very, very clear. You're week 18. One day in the book we'll read about why they were so adamant about not moving anything in January.
Yeah, and look, you and I are going to have to agree to disagree as far as the replacing players. I've said all along, the league said that from day one. I mean, that's why they had a bigger practice squad. That's why they had more flexible roster rules. That part of it is not nearly the issue for me whatsoever, because we had to know that.
Where is the line then? If they only had 32 players, literally, would they still play?
But that's the point. You can't have – but that's the point. You can't draw a line, because what is it? Is it your starting quarterback? Is it 3 starting wide receivers? Is it 3 guys on the offensive line? Is it 10 key backups? Like, you can't, because then that becomes as arbitrary as anything else you're talking about. This idea of competitive fairness that frankly doesn't really get applied nearly as much as we'd like to think when you consider that schedules are different and injuries occur all the time.
Well, and I've seen Spurgeon win and J.P. Lossman play games too. I mean, I've seen really poor football. So look, I mean,
that part of it was there was always going to be some of that when you were going to agree to play a season, unless, and this is where I'll go back to the point that I've made probably 100 times since the start of the Titans outbreak, you built in some time to give yourself some outs, and they never did that. And it's funny because I hear you talk about this this looking weird and sanctioning when guys aren't. I think part of that is we need to all accept, and the league failed in doing this the most, and now they're in this position as a result, that this wasn't going to be a normal season. That's why you do put in a couple extra open weeks. You have a bye week, or you give teams 2 bye weeks, or you build in an open week mid-season and have one at the end of the season. If you had done those things, you can curtail some of that. As I've said all along, for me, my issue is not that Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews and company could not play. It was getting to the point after you moved the game to Sunday, at that point, when it was evident that you weren't going to be able to play on Sunday. So when they made that decision on Friday afternoon, I guess it was, when they said they were going to move it to I've lost track, Tuesday or whenever it was supposed to be. But at that point, you had gotten so far removed from these guys being able to prepare to any meaningful degree from a practice standpoint, and even more importantly, giving them the opportunity to be able to condition and make sure they are physically sound going into the game. That for me, that was the cutoff where you say you got to move the game. I've said all along, if Lamar and take the 7 most notable players that missed Wednesday's game, if they had all tested positive last Monday and Tuesday, the outbreak had been contained Wednesday, you certainly would have pushed the game back from Thanksgiving. But you play on Sunday, then you give these guys that are left at least a couple days of some credible work at their facility where they can practice and get on the field. When that went away, and when you kick the can down the road 3 different times, that to me is when it becomes a farce. Not so much that all these practice squad players are playing. It's all these practice squad players are playing, and they didn't get an adequate chance to even try to prepare to play a competitive game. That for me is the much bigger issue because, again, we knew all along there were going to be guys that would miss time because of testing positive. You hoped and prayed that it wasn't going to be a widespread outbreak, but we saw this happen with the Marlins. We saw this happen with the St. Louis Cardinals. To me, that's where the NFL failed. They saw baseball have to deal with this, and baseball is a sport where you can play every day. You can play 7-inning doubleheaders. You're not afforded that luxury in the NFL. So instead of looking at it and saying, maybe it's not the best idea to play 256 games over the normal 17 weeks, complete with Thursday night games that are already a strain for these teams under normal circumstances. At that point, that's where they should have pivoted in August and said, all right, we're still going to play a 16-game schedule, but after week 7, we're going to have an open week. So week 8 is going to become week 9, and week 8 is going to be open, and any games that have to be made up will go into a prime time slot. So, hey, NBC or Fox or NFL Network or whoever, ESPN, we're going to hook you up with an extra nationally televised game, and that's going to be the only game of the week. And the players, we're showing you that we care about your safety. We understand that this is a hell of a strenuous year. We're going to give you some extra time off over the course of the season. You do that, you have another one at the end of the year. You still have your normal bye week. So even if you get to a point where a team has a widespread outbreak and has to miss a couple games, you have enough flexibility where even if you have to switch a bye week, something like that, you have outs to be able to do it. That to me is still where the league failed much more than RG3 playing quarterback against the Steelers, which, look, is very, very unfortunate. And it's very, it's lousy to see. It was lousy to see Jimmy Clausen playing against, who was it, the Seahawks or the Chiefs or whoever it was 5 years ago. You're going to have some strange situations like that. And again, I think it's very difficult to try to draw a proverbial line. The Ravens had a full roster on Wednesday. Now, it wasn't their championship playoff caliber roster, but we weren't talking about a case where they literally only had 30 players to compete in a game where, yeah, that would be a very legitimate safety issue from a logistics standpoint where guys are playing 2 ways and things like that. So I'm not
I can hear Goodell
that,
saying you lost 20 guys to COVID. We gave you 16 extra. Put them out there.
Well, but again, where do you draw the line? I just think it's really easy just to say, well, a team misses its quarterback or they missed their star running. I mean, where is that?
To your point, to say
we've
lost 20 players, we haven't had a chance to practice, we don't have the virus really contained,
that's the key.
And then they still played the football game at 3 o'clock on Wednesday.
Sure, and to be clear, I'm not condoning them playing the game on Wednesday. As I said, when it got to the point that they reached the end of the week, the building had been closed since Tuesday morning, and we'll go back to why was the building allowed to be reopened if this contact tracing has any shred of credibility, because we saw what happened after the fact. But when we got to the end of the week and the building was still shuttered and they still had guys testing positive, and even guys who weren't on that close contact list or guys that they were anticipating testing positive, they couldn't practice. They couldn't get into the facility to lift weights. They had no means other than, I don't know, maybe some of these guys have weights they could lift in their garage. I mean, that's what we were talking about here. To expect them then to go out and play a football game was just absolutely absurd at that point. And on the flip side,
if you don't need to practice and you don't need to lift weights and you don't need the hot tub and you don't need the facility, then you just play that way every week, right?
And this is where we even go over to the flip side. And look, I'm not expressing any sympathy for the Pittsburgh Steelers, but I think Mike Tomlin had them practice one time in the last 6 days. And look, people will say, well, that's on them. They didn't have an outbreak. Part of this is these aren't wind-up toys where these guys aren't just wind-up toys where you just say, oh, you just move the game back 3 days. Oh, we're going to move the game back another day or two. These are creatures of habit. These are human beings, and it's really difficult to play. This is a very difficult and complicated football game when you really get down to it. If you're someone that really tries to study the game and see what coverages are like and see what offenses are like.
The difference is between Luke Jones, school teacher in Susquehannock 12 years ago, and now living in and out of that building for 12 years. You played football, you love football, you study football, you're a historian of football, and there's a whole different level of what I understood about football after the 1996 season, right? Like
There's a
when they
lot that
came
goes
here
into it.
and I visited out there and I saw what really goes on, it was a little bit different than having Love You Blue pom-poms around here and, loving up Warren Moon.
No
And that's an
question.
education that only comes when you know what they're dealing with and you're not just screaming Harry on Monday morning.
Right. And so to go back to that, so you saw how the Steelers played with only having a few players missing because they had their week entirely disrupted as well. Because if you're Mike Tomlin, you're not going to have these guys practice 7 days in a row and you're running them into the ground. I mean, and look, I'm not saying that as to express sympathy. I'm explaining this whole situation of allowing these teams to play when you delay a game 6 days and one of the teams doesn't even have access to its building until less than 48 hours before the game was actually played. So you saw how even the team that wasn't experiencing the outbreak, how they played. I mean, Pittsburgh played an awful football game. I mean, anyone who hadn't watched the NFL this year, would they have had any belief whatsoever that was an undefeated football team that the
Well, the
Ravens went up
amazing
against?
thing to me is if they just catch the 4 passes they dropped in their hands,
Sure.
just those 4 plays, literally just catch the ball. Do what not what in the back of the end zone Luke Wilson drop. I mean, I'm just talking obviously Eric Ebron alone, but if they just catch those touchdown passes, the game's 30 to whatever at the end and it's not 12-7. They played really poorly. Yeah, no doubt about it, especially against the JV when their Tuits are out on the internet talking about, hey, today's the day to pad the stats. Well, not so much. Didn't work out that way.
Yeah, not so much.
Didn't even cover a spread.
Yeah, and again, I want to be clear for any Ravens fans who hate the Steelers. Yeah, I'm not expressing sympathy for them. I'm drawing another example of why it's important to be able to practice. Again, I'm not talking about Lamar and the guys who couldn't play and were isolating. I'm talking about RG3 and Tristan Colon Castillo and Des Bryant and Marlon Humphrey, the guys that were out there. It's really difficult to play this game at any kind of a high level when you're not able to practice. And the prep time that you get amounts to a couple watered down walkthroughs even.
20 minutes on the field at 10 in the morning in Pittsburgh, right? In the cold, literally.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, so that's the point I'll continue to come back to, beyond the questions as far as why the building was reopened the Monday afternoon after the Titans game, beyond the issue of if Geno Stone truly was a player that you anticipated testing positive, why was he taking part in walkthroughs the last couple of days? So those are those are the legitimate league and protocol questions where it's like, what the heck is that? You're talking this good game as far as everything you're doing, but how do those two things specifically happen? But then we get into the it's competitive balance, but for me, it's more so not putting Jimmy Smith in a position where he hurts his groin. And let's be clear, Jimmy Smith's gotten hurt throughout his career. I don't want to say that.
But this makes it more likely when you don't practice. Sure.
Robert Griffin III talked about the fact that, sure, no question. And again, that puts both teams at risk. And that's where even the Steelers, who didn't practice a whole lot, and Mike Tomlin was trying to find that sweet spot. It just speaks to where this does become a farce and where it does jump the shark, where you're playing a game 6 days after it was originally scheduled, and one team has had access to its building, the other hasn't, so that's not fair. But even the team who had access, they lost their bye week earlier this year. So Mike Tomlin's trying to juggle giving his players some time off with keeping them sharp, and John Harbaugh doesn't even have that option. So you get into, again, it's bad enough with the guys that were missing from the Ravens side. And let's keep in mind, the Steelers had a couple key players missing as well on the COVID list, just as a footnote to this. But, then when you get into the players who are available, the practice squad guys where you made the rules flexible to promote them so you'd have a full roster of players. I mean, they had 48 guys in uniform, which is the max that you can have. But those guys didn't have any kind of credible time to prepare. And even worse than that, didn't have the resources and the time and the ability to adequately keep their bodies prepared and in shape to the way that they normally would. And that's where you get into looking at some of the injuries on Wednesday, not that we've seen way worse, quote, body bag type games as far as the physicality of Ravens and Steelers. So, I don't want to be too over the top about it, but when you do look at those injuries, you wonder, how much of that was part of the game and how much of that was, this guy, he was jogging around his property and lifting weights in his garage, and that was the extent of what he's been able to do over the last week compared to, I don't know, being in your multi-million-dollar facility getting ready for a game that has so much riding on it and part of a multi-billion-dollar operation in the NFL. So that's where I'll continue to come back to much more than looking at the roster and saying all these guys were missing. It was the guys who were there who didn't really have a fair shot in terms of just being able to keep their bodies ready. And that's a way bigger issue for me than the overall presentation or quality of the game.
Luke Jones can be found at Baltimore. Luke, if I find Justin Tucker, we're going to compare fried chicken recipes, his Texas and my Baltimore here as I watched the commercial for Rofo the other day. Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. Don't forget the coffee. We tell you about it all the time. Our friends at Taharka are shipping the ice cream. I've got the box here. This is the 8-pack box. Lots of change going on, social change happening with Taharka. It's a city packed with culture, creativity, and endless possibility. I think so, too. So that's why I live in Baltimore. We are Baltimore Positive, and that's why you will get $15.70 off if you use Baltimore Positive as your code with Taharka. I am Nestor. We're going to continue to delve into this. I'm going to be talking all sorts of national writers in anticipation of the Dallas Cowboys game on Tuesday night as we go into the weekend. Jamie Costello is going to be here. My old pal Rafael Alvarez joining us on Baltimore Positive this week. We're also going to be chatting in and about all things Dallas Cowboys through the weekend. Plenty ahead for you. You can find us, Luke, certainly at Baltimore Luke, out on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all of those cool places, as well as me, Nasty at WNST.net. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 Towson, Baltimore, branded together with great post-game coverage of Steelers Ravens out at Baltimore Positive.